And welcome to podcast 57 of the Relationship Restaurant. We are Poppy and Jeff Spencer. Delighted to have you with us. And we are all about heart-healthy communications on the Relationship Restaurant. Our discussion today is going to be the 3 real reasons why your marriage isn't working and what you can do to make it awesome. Poppy and I have invested a lot of time researching this great institution of marriage in our Western culture. And we've done some research about it in other countries and other cultures as well. We've examined why people marry, why they don't marry, and what some of the causes of frictions in a marriage can be, and how to address that.
Also, and welcome everybody. At the end of our podcast, we have a special gift for the first person to email us at pg@poppyandjeff.com. That's P like Paul, G like George, at POPPYANDGEOFF.com, and share with us 2 takeaways that you might find valuable from this podcast. So here's what we found intriguing in our research. We found, number 1, couples report less happiness in their relationships and marriages than in previous years. So these are the young adults of today. Number 2, we find that communication has become limited between these couples. And number 3, they have a lack of awareness of their own marriage evolution or their relationship evolution. That's how it's developed over time and what happens in that process.
So let's break this down. We're going to start with less happiness. Today, with online dating, the apps like Tinder and Bumble, the millennials, previous generations, 50% divorce rates, shadowing their decision to make and sustain committed relationships. And young people are just not very happy.
I know. And we see this a lot in our counseling and certainly in our research of millennials. We've found that happening.
They're having a hard time getting into relationships.
Yes. And according to this article that we recently saw on The Atlantic, young adults are swapping out couple time at home for friends and other community associations and affiliations. And the article mentioned that one key factor in the happiness that's missing from this young adult life is, and it may surprise you, what this one key unhappiness ingredient is. Want to guess what it is?
Sex.
You got it. So, of course,
the guy thinks that.
Right, of course.
The Atlantic article suggests that if Americans still had sex like they did in, say, 2008 or even 2012, we might be a much happier country. And certainly the decline in young adults marrying due to their own parents' divorces and lack of religious affiliations, where previous generations often met their spouse. So this is a clear area. We've seen this. A lot of the young people are just not going to church.
Or temple or synagogue
or whatever,
or mosque.
the place of worship.
Right.
And that's so often where a lot of these relationships can be forged, and they can meet the kind of people that might want to marry.
Right.
In other words, Americans are offsetting some of the lost community and companionship of spouses and churches with closer ties to friends. But those friendships don't give young Americans the sex life that made previous generations happier. So they do have friends, they have friendships.
And even friends with benefits still doesn't cut it.
No, because it's often, and we were talking about this earlier too, about the meaningfulness, like even the Tinder and Bumble things can often provide quick hookups where they can have some quick sex, but there's often a lack of intimacy and meaningfulness in that.
Right. So this sexlessness that sort of plagues young adults today begs the question, well, how does this young generation, the millennials, get satisfaction, happiness in their relationships? So we're going to need to find new ways and opportunities to get this cohort who are putting off marriage, avoiding committed relationships, to get some happiness. And it appears that hookup sex, like we just said, is just not working. People want those meaningful relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And while we're on the topic of meaningful relationships, let's discuss what one of the things men first recognize in their need to find a woman. And this is something that I used to teach in my psychology class at 8:30 in the morning. And students would close their laptops, put down their phones, put down their drawings if they were my art students.
Because you'd mentioned sex.
Yes, we'd mentioned sex. But one of the things that men first recognize in their need to find a woman is the hips, because it's often an unconscious, sort of an involuntary sign that a man looks for a woman for childbearing. Her hips indicate fertility, future generations, his legacy to be continued. So oftentimes men will be attracted to a woman for that reason.
It's the classic hourglass figure, I think, and breasts as well, I'm sure, to feed those offspring.
Right.
Another factor, and our second point of one reason why communication is so limited in relationships, is the digital consumption. People and couples are basically lonely. They adapted their relationships to digital screens. And in a recent New York Times article, a small percentage of people have begun to recognize that banishing screen time is now considered something just for the elite. You know,
it was crazy. Yeah, this article.
I'm gonna be pushing away my screen and not doing that anymore. And if your primary love language is human touch, and you're not in that small percentage of elites who have started to banish that screen time, you're probably going to be unhappy because you're not getting that sensation of physical touch that you so badly need.
Right. We had Gary Chapman on our podcast a couple episodes ago. If you want to hear that, it's great. If you don't know your primary love language, find out.
I always say this to the gentlemen that listen, because this is often something that the guys completely, totally miss. I laugh often, Poppy. I've seen guys, I'll be grocery shopping, say, without you sometimes, and I'll see a guy with a pile of roses, dozen roses, and that's all he's getting. You know, this isn't like one of many shopping items. It's just roses. And I always look at him and go, well, what'd you do? And, you know, and yeah, you're in trouble, right? And that is almost like a first gesture for a lot of guys. It's
instinctual.
Right.
It's sort of a knee-jerk reaction to something.
It's a gift giving. And if your person's love language and or apology language is another subset of love languages, doesn't fall into the realms of a gift giving, then it isn't going to help a whole lot.
Right. And gift giving could be way down on the primary list.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you always want to attend to that. So the third factor that contributes to our research on marriage dissatisfaction is the lack of awareness for people's own marriage evolution. And what we mean by that is as the marriage develops. So when you get married, there's lots of time for each other. You usually only have to attend to each other, right? But communication is sometimes more open, but then wham, there's a family member's illness or emergency, or you have a new baby.
Oh, that's absolutely where it is.
Right.
We were just recently reading Eli Finkel's book.
His book is called The All or Nothing
Marriage. All or Nothing Marriage,
It's
right.
fabulous. It was published just in January of 2019. It's a great read.
He speaks of what happens to typically the wife and now the new mother, whose attention has completely shifted to the new infant. Finkel says to acknowledge that what's taking place is a phase, okay? That couple recognize and communicate that this is a phase one, as he calls it, and make active plans to reclaim the marriage in a reasonable amount of time. And getting through it is important, and always make time for one another. We know that's much easier said than done, yet it still needs to be a priority. It's an awareness that we're talking about here, that you have to realize that this is going to happen. We're going to have the child, especially a newborn, is going to require tons and tons of effort and focus. But as soon as one can, one needs to start refocusing back on each other and the marriage and just not lose track of that, because it's one of those things that can start to really derail a marriage if you don't refocus and eventually get back to, hey, we still need to talk to each other. We still need to share. We still need to have intimacies. We still need to do those things. We just can't give it up for the sake of the child.
Right. And I think it's happened, unfortunately, so many times today, is that the infant grows up, and certainly we're going to address that just a little bit later here, and to reset those expectations so that the new mom doesn't have to do it all, or the new dad doesn't have to do it all, that you have allowed yourself to some slack, some emotional and marital slack, to come back to this when the training wheels are off, so to speak, in this then. So we've come up with 3 solutions.
Yep, to help deepen your marriage and the relationship. I guess it's, first of all, it's just to be the good enough partner. I know we were talking about this earlier. Good enough.
We talk about that all the time. And, you know, when I was doing my graduate work many years ago, I stumbled upon D.W. Winnicott. He was a psychoanalyst and a pediatrician who coined the term the good enough mother. So his premise was that The new mother gave her newborn infant every desire that he or she peeped about, basically, always at the infant's beck and call. The mother attended to her offspring 24/7, and in doing so, she was the perfect mother. But then she began to lose sleep and maybe get sick, and she was wearing down, and her resolve was diminishing. And the best familiar situation of this is on the airplane. The good enough mother comes from on the air travel, and passengers traveling with small children are told to put what?
In case of an emergency, put the mask for yourself on first.
Right.
So you can still keep breathing versus the mother's instinct to dive to help the child. And of course, in that process, not get oxygen themselves, and then they would be failing, right, and everybody would lose.
Right. So basically,
take care of yourself
the perfect
first.
Mother doesn't put the oxygen mask on herself first. So we want to say, be a good enough mother, be a good enough partner, just good enough that in our oftentimes unconscious goal to be perfect, sometimes we're not even aware of it. We have relegated our best self to the back burner, and we give so much to another person, we tend to compromise our own emotional availability, physicality, and we drain our energies.
I'm going to go back to this. As you were saying this, the perfect mother, you said, it's actually the imperfect mother doesn't put the air mask on themselves. That's why our point here is that in the effort to be so perfect, you're failing.
Right.
It is, you cannot achieve this perfection. It's not a reasonable and achievable goal. You have to still maintain focus on your own health, your own well-being, and the well-being of the marriage. That will make you as the good enough, which is the target you should be going for. And we're not saying sell yourself short.
Right. And so Winnicott suggests that mothers let babies begin to self-soothe for a little bit, a short period of time, a couple minutes maybe. And then this allows the infant to begin to experience a teeny bit of discomfort or even frustration. And this is like a lot of times then they give them what psychologists call a transitional object. This is the stuffed teddy bear, the blankie, the pacifier. This is to help the child, almost give the child training wheels to start that self-soothing process.
Learn how to cope.
Right. And we think that today, unfortunately, there are quite a few millennials out there who did not have good enough parents, but rather perfect parents. The masterfully exceptional parents who wanted to raise overachievers and who at the first utterance or sound or whimper rushed to their child's side. And unfortunately, I think many of these same parents continued this overtly attentiveness and produced a society of children who have very underdeveloped coping skills. Their problem-solving skills are almost non-existent because mom and dad always rush to save the day. They even have limited social and communication skills.
Millennials today, through no fault of their own, often struggle to establish deep, meaningful relationships because they never had to experience much struggle or discomfort.
Right. They were Winnicotted throughout their life.
What millennials reveal to us today is that they're not wanting marriage as much as previous generations did, possibly because many are afraid that they too will end up divorced. They've seen so much of this.
Sure.
They also show us that many have limited problem-solving skills, as we talked about, to address the complexities in a marriage. And a committed relationship in name only may feel safer to millennials than a marriage.
Right. So I'm just going to be in a relationship with somebody, but I'm not going to take the next step.
As these children become young adults, then many don't have the relationship tools to develop a meaningful and intimate relationship because all of their human communication history was often resolved by these so-called perfect parents trying to achieve perfection. So they never had to learn how to communicate those things. They never had an opportunity to figure it out for themselves.
Right. And I think my master thesis was heavily influenced by Winnicott and by being the good enough parent, friend, daughter, whatever it is, sister, whatever it was. And so I think we all have periods in our life where we sort of wax and wane in and out of feeling good enough. Were there ever times in your life where you didn't feel good enough, either a personal relationship or professional or hobby?
And certainly there's always times. I know I've had multiple hobbies that I was still active in many ways. Others, like Poppy knows this very well, I was a very active competitive sailor. And I achieved, great success on local and regional district levels. And then when I went to the top of the heap there to compete, say, in the national championships, the North American championships for the class of boat that I was in, I found myself, I'm in the top 15 in the country, approaching top 10. But to get to the absolute top there was really, really, really hard. Part of it was because, and this is where, again, I was able to calm myself about this, is because I was not a professional sailor. This wasn't my full-time job. Often the guys at the very top were professionals. They were the people that made the sails or they built the boats. And so they had a dedicated life to this, and this was all they did. So I had to soothe myself saying, I'm not a professional and I'm an amateur. So I'm doing great. As an amateur, I was good enough, and I didn't want to be a professional sailor.
Right.
So that was good enough. And
I think that that's so important to recognize that. But if you have a long spell of not feeling good enough, absolutely, please, we recommend people to talk to somebody, a professional, a counselor, a therapist, to help you just get back on track to being just good enough.
Poppy, I know you've had those times where you haven't felt good enough.
I mean, I think the first time I was aware of not being good enough was when the birth of my first child. And I was surrounded by moms, both working and stay-at-home moms, who dealt with child rearing as a professional, as an exceptional, overachieving professional. And so when I didn't have the right answer or the right equipment or the right something, I think I had a good enough breast pump. I nursed, and there was so many types of judgments that I interpreted from other moms. There'd be a slight grimace. Oh, you don't have this state-of-the-art car seat. You only have this crib. You only have this stroller.
There is always something.
Right.
There will always be something that you've fallen short on.
Your child doesn't sleep through the night already. Whatever it was, there was all of these like little messages that got inside, until at one point I remember asking, I don't think I'm a good mom. I must not be doing this right. And people that have read all the books, and it was very refreshing. I remember going to the pediatrician at the 3-month checkup, and he said, don't read any books. Just do what you think is right. You've got this. And it was like, thank you. It was such a relief to be able to do that.
And this never changes. This is continually happening in our society, right, where you name any topic and someone has got the newest, best trend in whatever it is,
or the answers that you don't have.
Right.
And even in my personal relationships in the past, I struggled with not being good enough. And so I would channel my efforts. I became a pretty good tennis player, golfer, winning tournaments. I sought a master's degree to teach psychology, and that became very fulfilling. So that was how I nourished the lack of being good enough in my personal relationship on these outside things. And I think we just need to follow Winnicott's research and premise to be good enough, to be the good enough wife, to be the good enough husband, the good enough friend, the good enough employee, the good enough client, the good enough anything.
And how you do this is twofold. You first of all examine the thoughts and feelings that surface when you begin to compare yourself to others, which is always a dangerous thing, comparing yourself to others. And don't be reactive and feel rejection or internalize the other's commentary or body language or micro expressions, their raised eyebrows and a little grimace or the smug look that they give you when that you're feeling you're not good enough and measuring up.
And it so often happens. So what we say to do instead is to pause for introspection. Really look at yourself. When you have that clenched feeling in the stomach, or you feel your energy level drop, or you hold your breath because somebody has said something that you now internalize as feeling badly. So ask yourself, what's making you feel badly? Are you perhaps over-interpreting? Are you tired? Are you hangry? Have you not taken time for yourself? Basically, don't be that hamster on the wheel going. And the second thing to do is consider the source. Is the source in a good place? The person that has made you feel something that's projecting, are they projecting something onto you, their own insecurities and fears? And so what we really need to do is to take I am time, which is our code for introspection moment, And once you take that time to examine those thoughts and feelings, you really already turned the corner on being good enough.
Then it's just a matter of redirecting your thoughts. And well, it's like this. Well, I came in third in this regatta, but that's good enough. If all I did was sail, like we were saying before, and didn't have this job that I do have, or I was retired and I could do all my time traveling to regattas, and I could probably have won this event as well. But it's the idea of also, did you do your best?
Right.
If you know you did your best, do you feel good about that and move on?
Right. One of the things that I did to have an introspective moment was when I first applied for the psychology professor job at the college. I didn't tell a soul. I knew myself well enough that I might be susceptible to others' comments or non-comments. And so that if I told a bunch of people I wanted to teach psychology at the college, many of them might have had insecurities. They might have questioned my actions, would have doubted my own path. And at time, I might have banished that goal. And so I didn't want to do that.
So what does all this have to do with marriages and relationships?
Okay, right. Okay. So in our relationships and marriage, we also have to recalibrate, as Eli Finkel says in his book, All or Nothing Marriage. We have to dial down our expectations so that we don't make our partner be everything to us, that they have to fulfill our every need. Because if our partner becomes our best friend, our mentor, our wise sage, our validator for everything, we start to lose some identity dimension. We become fused or morph into a loss of our own individual selves.
And this happened even to us personally. Poppy was questioning something in our lives and in herself. I was giving the best help I could, trying to be a good listener, trying to give advice, and I realized that I didn't have good enough answers. And Poppy got in touch with a long-standing good friend of hers and had a long, good conversation. And that friend, who was always good at helping her with those kinds of refocusing and recalibrations, got her right back on track.
Right.
And again, it was helpful because I couldn't do it all. I wasn't able to do it.
And the good enough in a relationship is what is
we
desirable.
can't have perfect. That is it.
Well, wait a minute. If my husband tells me I'm perfect, well, I'm not going to really argue with him, right?
Right. And we see this a lot in our counseling with clients, in their marriages and committed relationships as well. The couples who don't accept that they're good enough, those who compare themselves to others, often have huge challenges when they come to us. It's a real problem. People just say, well, they seem to be much happier. They have more fun. They're laughing. They're whatever they're doing. And we're not like that.
Right. And one of the most important things to do is we've come up with 3 things to deepen your marriage or relationship. And the first one, as we said, is to be a good enough partner. And the second one we said was to authenticate. Explain how that goes.
We were kind of saying the word was really validate was the point we were saying. But in so many things we're doing now, when we sign up online, when we are going to our online banking, when we're doing anything, we're always having to authenticate.
You have to get a text message with a code to authenticate.
Whatever those different things are that we have to go through to authenticate who we are. It's so important that you authenticate or validate your partner. Let them know what you feel about them, how wonderful they are. And I think it's especially easy for Poppy and I because of our journey and the time apart. We never lose track of that. 32 years apart makes you really conscious of what you do have.
Right. And we don't take that for granted.
We don't take it for granted.
We are grateful. We cherish that and we acknowledge it every time. In Eli Finkel's book, I know you were really captivated by the passage where he talked about. Yeah,
he says it's important to get other sources to validate you and to authenticate you. So all these various needs just don't fall on just the husband. In fact,
or the wife.
Or the wife. The point he was making when we were younger and single, we had, say, 5 people that we would go to fulfill. One I would be an exercise partner. One would be somebody I would be in a book club with. Somebody else would be a party person I'd go out to parties with. There'd be all these different needs are met by as many as, say, like 5 different people. And when you get married, you often focus your time much more just on the spouse. And that spouse now often has to fulfill all those different requirements for validation for you.
And then they become the perfect spouse instead of the good enough spouse.
Right.
And then everybody's expectations are not met.
Mm-hmm.
And the third thing that we talked about was communication. And we developed our communication tool that we trademarked called the emotional clock. And it helps us to check those emotional landmines that accidentally trip us up. The emotional clock, if you want to just share a brief overview of what that does, it's a tactile tool that we use. And when we find that if people can actually keep it outside and actually write on it or use it in a handheld device.
Yeah, it looks like a clock, and all the settings on the right side of the clock are all the disempowered things when the communication, emotions of disempowerment, when communication isn't taking place. And it builds all the way up to anger, and then you hit a wall at 6 o'clock where you try to make a decision about, I have to do something here. Can I resolve this, or do I have to leave this relationship? And this is always where usually we end up talking to people, and we try to help them either resolve and work their way up the left side of the clock back towards fulfillment and love and empowerment. And so it's just a great tool that you can look at it and say, this is where I am. I'm feeling just shame about what I've said, and I'm at 4 o'clock, and how do I move on from here?
Right. And I think it's so important. In our counseling, we work with couples. We actually give them the exact words to say to their partner, especially when things get a little dicey, uncomfortable, or even heated.
Is this our point 3?
Well, no, it's communication is our point 3. But
yeah,
to be able to say in a point, I'm afraid that when I say this, it's going to make you upset. It's going to
come out wrong.
Or come out wrong.
Yeah,
or,
I don't know how to say this exactly,
But if you just bear with me. And in that showing that embracing vulnerability, you've really sort of dropped the thing. Like you always say about Star Wars, your Star Wars metaphor.
Put down the lightsaber. There's that great scene in the third of the original 3 shows where Luke is battling Darth Vader, and the Emperor is encouraging this anger and this fight, and he wants Luke to become the great new warrior. And Luke sees it. He's succumbing to some of the dark side of the Force, and he shuts down. He goes, no, it shuts off the lightsaber. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to give in to the dark side. And he turns off that angry side, and realizes that will not serve him.
Right. And so embracing vulnerability at first blush sounds kind of like...
Sounds weak.
It sounds
especially
like...
for a guy.
Especially for a guy, right? And especially for all the empowered women that are out there today, too.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't sound good, and so we shy away from it. But we're saying, actually, when you do embrace it, in fact, we wrote about it in our Amazon bestselling book, with complete vulnerability comes absolute empowerment. That was one of our famous lines in our book.
And that's a really hard concept for people to wrap their heads around. But it is absolutely true, because when you've completely exposed those things and are vulnerable, you can no longer get surprised or hurt. Now you've completely opened up, and you're now in a position where whatever the truth is will now come out. And
right.
You're very much empowered now.
And it's empowering for both people in that example. And so we always say that if you have something that's difficult to say, don't not say it. We see this in our sessions with people all the time, is that they go, she won't communicate, he won't communicate, he's shut down, she's shut down. And that's not embracing vulnerability.
That's always the recipe for a marriage and relationship to fail.
Right. And so if you can say those things, and these are, I promise you, the good enough, you don't have to have the perfect words. You just need good enough words. And so...
And we always, again, say, if you start with the expressions like, I'm afraid that what I'm going to say is going to really upset you in some way, or that you might not be able to understand me and I might not do it right. It usually opens the door when you say those kind of things that the other party was already softening, just hearing that right. They'll say like, well, no, go ahead, say it. I'm sure you'll say it fine, and I'll understand. And
they're braced for something, like braced for impact on an airplane. And Scully, the point is that you have opened the doors of communication. You've got everybody's attention that's privy to what you're going to say. And so that is the good enough approach that we wanted to say.
Okay, we mentioned at the beginning that we're going to have a gift for you, and it is Eli Finkel's awesome book, The All or Nothing Marriage. And the first one of you are relationship restaurant listeners who send us an email to PG, which is, of course, Poppy and Jeff, pg@poppyandjeff.com.
And that's POPPYANDGEOFF.
And you share these 2 takeaways from this recording, you'll receive Finkel's hardcover book, which is an excellent read. And please include your mailing address so we know where to send it.
Right. And so any takeaways that you found from this podcast, if you just plop them in the email, or you can go to our page and say, contact us, poppyandjeff.com, and we will send it right out. And so we so hope you enjoy this podcast of the Relationship Restaurant. We're Poppy and Jeff, and we want you to know that being good enough is just right.
Until next time, see ya.